Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space, an initiative designed to facilitate a planetary conversation and exploration of the intersecting issues and hard problems central to the continued transition of humans to a spacefaring civilization. This is episode 24, Art and Space. Before we understood the cosmos, or there were spacecraft off-world, we imagined it, we painted it, we wrote about it, and we expressed it through music. Science and space exploration didn't begin with science, it began with art. Physician and Renaissance thinker Leonard Shlain wrote, "Artists have mysteriously incorporated into their works features of a physical description of the world that science later discovers." Going forward, this same creative instinct has and will continue to help us wonder, to help us imagine life off-world, solve complex problems, and explore the nature and the culture that might emerge in space. Our guests today include Andy Jackson, a space travel geek and frustrated astronaut. He's also a writer of poetry with 4 collections, including The Assassination Museum, A Beginner's Guide to Cheating, The Saints Are Coming, and Games Night. Andy is the founder of Project Abiona and is also the editor of over a dozen anthologies of poetry, including Split Screen, Double Bill, and Scotia Extremis. He's coordinator of several online poetry projects, including New Boots and Pontisocracies and Otwituaries. Find out more about Andy at www.andyjacksonpoet.co.uk. Amy Karle is an internationally acclaimed ultra-contemporary artist, bioartist, and futurist, whose work explores the implications of frontier science and technology on humanity, evolution, and the future across scales and system. She creates works that make ethical, existential, and civilizational questions tangible through form. Her practice bridges the biological and computational, asking who we are becoming through the systems we create and engage. Named one of BBC's 100 most inspiring and influential women, a pioneer in design, and one of the most influential women in 3D printing, Karle is a former U.S. Department of State AAI artist diplomat and was artist in residence at the Copernicus Space Center in Warsaw. Our host and moderator is Chris Kimmel, the founder of Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of the commercial space company Space Tango.
Hello, this is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. Welcome again to what I think is the perhaps 23rd or 24th webcast for the initiative. And, we have a very interesting conversation today around the topic of art in space and exploring the role that art has had and can have and will have in the future on helping us imagine space exploration and also the humanity part of this. Before we start, I want to thank the sponsors for Humanity in Deep Space. They always start out by that. Space 629, Space for Good, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, National Stem Cell Foundation, Baird Financial, Media Collaboratory, Kentucky Humanities Council, Higher Orbits, Human Space Solutions, Visit Lex, Interstellar Foundation, 22 Solutions, and Space Tango. So having said that, let me start off by asking you all to introduce yourselves and let the group know out there that kind of a little bit about yourself. Of course, they've seen your bios, but we'll start with you, Amy.
I'm Amy Karle. I'm an artist working at this intersection of art, design, and technology, biology too. I use creative practice to explore how emerging technologies are impacting humanity and our future, how they're impacting our identity and our ethics across scales and systems on Earth and beyond.
Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Jackson, and I'm a writer, mostly of poetry, edit poetry anthologies, various web-based projects. I run a poetry magazine and a small publishing company. I'm kind of interested in where poetry and all the stuff that people don't write poems about meet. And I jokingly say, if anyone asks me what I write about, it's usually the sweepings up on the poetry laboratory floor that I'm interested in. Other poets take the grand themes of love, death, grief, and I take other stuff like space and reggae music and football and things that are not necessarily picked up by poetry generally. So I am filling in the gaps, and that's my job, I suppose, today, I guess.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you might also let the audience know one of the very creative projects that you've initiated called Project Abiona, which kind of fits your interest in space.
It does. It came from a conversation that Chris and I had quite a while back about something completely unrelated to space, and I found out what he did for a living and involved in space tango and other things. And I said, I've always wanted to do some kind of space poetry anthology thing, but real, not bug-eyed monsters, not fantasy, but real, based on plausible scientific futures. And I spoke to a few friends after speaking to Chris, and one particular guy, Simon Barraclough, who I've worked with before, very much involved in the world of science and poetry. And I knew he would be excited. Whether he would have time to indulge my crazy idea, I wasn't sure, but he picked up on it, and very quickly we added a third person, Dr. Amy Norton, who is at Stanford University as a research astronomer. And between the three of us, we developed a project to put together, first of all, a plausible timeline for the next 300 years of human development out into space, and then ask poets to write as if they were in that future. So, writing back to the present, but in the guise of people living their lives, as we say, beyond the Kármán line. So, anywhere outside of sort of 100 nautical miles upwards. And that's kind of what we've ended up with. So that we may talk about the website later on, but
Yeah.
we have people writing poems about FedEx deliveries on the moon and trying to develop symphony orchestras in space and polishing the floors of space stations and going through the criminal justice system out in space. All sorts of human experiences which are not necessarily different from those we experience now, but they just happen to be a bit further out from where we are. So the real world, but the future real world, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Uh, and I would be remiss as one of our key sponsors and a company I co-founded by just saying we're all very excited at the success of Artemis 2 and the bone marrow avatar experiment that Space Tango and Emulate, biotech company in Boston that we're involved in. So really want to congratulate NASA and everybody who was involved in this miraculous and inspirational mission, and just really looking forward to the next step. So having said that, let me just start out by a general question about looking back in art, going a kind of deep history, and your thoughts on, uh, the role that art has had
Mhm.
in helping us understand and imagine not only technology and science, and in this case, space, but also just humanity.
That's a
Amy, you
good
want to
one.
start?
Yeah. Long before we are able to explore space or could build civilizations off-world, we have to picture this in some way and narrate it, rehearse it. How does it feel to be in those environments? Why are we so interested in it? How can we imagine it? How can we argue with it? How can we ethically shape it? And art and design is such a fundamental part of that process. It allows us to sense these consequences before they harden into systems or infrastructure. It allows us to navigate these spaces and see what really resonates in our hearts and minds. And this is something I think throughout the history of art about space and now art in space that it imagines what is really out there and who are we in relationship to what's out there. For me, space is not something that's separate from the body or separate from intelligence or from culture. It's all part of it. We're all part of this system, and it's a continuation of the same inquiry of, what are our responsibilities to one another across these different scales of existence? What are our relationships across the scale? How does looking up into the sky give us a feeling about who we are and our place in it? So this is how I see one of the roles of art about space and in space through history.
Thanks. Before we go on, just want to remind people watching, you can ask questions through the chat application, and we certainly welcome those at any point. So, Andy, what are your thoughts following up on what Amy said?
Yeah, I guess I come maybe not from the sort of representational arts. I can't draw at all. I'm terrible at anything that involves, kind of dexterity. But I am a great movie buff. Not as great as my pal Simon, who I mentioned before, who is very movie literate. But I have spent my life watching the world in the future through the eyes of cinematographers, and it's amazing how many varied versions of the Earth and our future there might be through cinema. So that kind of art has always had um, a strong sense of identity, what the world will be. There's kind of two, I always thought there's sort of two models of the future. There's the Star Trek model where everything is pristine and oiled and noble and organized. And then there's the grungy sort of alien style future in the cinematographer's art, which is grungy and boring and corporate and not in the least bit noble. So I've taken in the future through the cinematographer's eye, and but to me, art is a bit more than that. I mean, I guess cave paintings. People painted what they saw on cave paintings, and there were always stars in the sky. So we have always observed things at a distance and tried to represent them somehow as part of our lives and what we experience every day. And I don't see that leap into the future as being, a big sort of Rubicon moment. We are gradually going forward into the future, and we will take everybody with us. The people who write, the people who paint, the people who make movies, they will all be there in the future, but they may not necessarily be in the same place as they are now. So art doesn't feel like it won't change that much. It will just be the context that changes.
Andy, I love what you're talking about, and I want to point out that you depicted this really dynamic range across arts of, these really enlightened futures, this polished future, or our ultimate demise. And artwork across many different forms to me has always significantly stood as, an emotional relation to these kinds of dynamics, and also canary in the coal mine in many situations. How art helps us feel these potential futures, even if they're negative ones, and then also project out what our ideal futures might be.
Yeah, I think looking at that, I mean, art has also, I think, in many ways, has artists have kind of imagined the future and imagined actually scientific discoveries before the scientists did. I think I read where the bending of light was actually imagined by an artist before we had Einstein's theories and some of those things. So, what are some of the other areas where you think art has really been kind of transformational in our imagination and helping us not just imagine, but actually realize the future?
Once again, drawing on your example there of somebody, speculating on the bending of light and actually painting that or representing it somehow, there's a whole screed of books written which are trying to reverse engineer the science fiction universe into real science. If a novelist or a director or a scriptwriter imagines something that we could do out in space, somebody will go back to the science community and say, okay, so that's imagination. How feasible is that? Can we make that work? And again, great science fiction, the hard sci-fi world is often it's given stars because it's close to the science. It's not fantasy. It could happen. So Christopher Nolan's Interstellar was praised because it depicted something of a real future in the stars, the time dilation and all that sort of playing about with timelines was real. And scientists love that because we're not making this up. We are using science to imagine a future, not using imagination to imagine science. So it's kind of an odd paradox there a little bit.
Yeah, Amy. Yeah, before just start, Amy. I mean, it seems to me that part of what your amazing work does is actually do this. I mean, I look at your work and it's very imaginative and inspirational. And so maybe I'm wrong, but I see you kind of in this, some of the work you do very much in this mold.
Thank you. I work with scientists and technologists in almost all my projects. And something that I find over and over is that we're asking so many of the same fundamental questions. And we're just asking them in different mediums through different ways. But there's often this sense that we share, a lot of us share about what is happening, what is coming. There's phenomena that we inherently understand in our beings, in our bodies, but we don't know how to name. We don't know how to describe. We don't know how to measure. So, for example, we have this whole dynamic state that's happening inside of us all the time of like emotional states of different activity, things that are going on inside of us that science still can't measure so well. Maybe we can measure brain waves, but what is really happening in this dynamic internal system that makes us alive and makes us human? That is something that, irrespective of your field, a lot of us feel and are very intimately in tune with. Now, how do we express that is part of this process. So, for artists, expressing on this kind of emotional, resonant level that is doesn't have to be so articulated with measurement or other methods. We can explain these phenomenon that we feel in another way of communicating. So I think this is a really strong way that artists can share these different things that we feel, and many of us actually can say they have a knowing of that scientists are still searching to define, but artists can express.
Um, Clint Collins, who's one of our big supporters and a colleague and has been on a couple of webcasts, drew my attention in thinking about this webcast to, if anyone's heard of Chelsea Bonestell, who I had not heard of, but actually was an artist who was at the forefront of imagining space back in the primarily in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Um, and I would encourage people to go and do a search on him because his artwork was quite amazing and very futuristic. And he had a great reputation and a lot of people. I mean, Werner von Braun said that combined with best scientific and engineering knowledge of the time and scientific exactness and artistic imagination, that came to what Chesley was doing. So I would encourage people to look back, like take a peek at his work because I think it speaks to a lot of the things that we're talking about. So as we think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, excuse me for so I just looked Chelsea Bonestell up, and on the website, the first Google notation that came up for me is it says Chelsea Bonestell, a brush with the future. I love
Wow.
this description.
So let's talk about just a second. What about the other forms of art? I mean, we're talking about literature and poetry and certain your art, Amy, but what about other forms of art like music, other things like that that have also uh, had this kind of impact?
Well, Andy brought up cinema
Right.
as well.
I think cinema is an obvious example because it puts on the screen what might be in our imagination. But I think poetry is closer to music in that respect, in that poetry does not give you the full picture in the same way that if you listen to, I mean, there was a whole strand of music in the 70s coming mostly from mainland Europe, which was called cosmic or kosmische, and it was mostly German, and it was mostly characterized by being full of space. It was not dense at all. It wasn't grungy sort of Nirvana style. It was really full of emptiness. And I wonder whether then maybe that would also offer an impressionist picture of the future, of space, of out there, but not necessarily give you a perfectly represented pixel by pixel view, which takes away some of the mystery. In the same way that poetry needs to have space so that you can fill in the blanks with your own experience. I think a lot of music that strives to try and depict space or conjure up an idea of space is probably doing the same thing, giving you enough space to imagine what's out there rather than
Right.
telling you for certain.
What about as we think of space? What about? I mean, most of the work that I certainly have seen living in the the United States is, Western influence. What about how do we factor in and how do we appreciate and not ignore these kinds of artistic influences from other cultures?
I'll take that one. So I think
Yeah.
this is a larger question that is beyond art, that's then secondarily reflected in art. The bigger question, I think, is what are the cultural values we're imposing here? What are the value
Hmm.
system we're imposing? So this is something that I question a lot. And Chris, we had previous conversations
Right.
before about, if we discover life elsewhere, this would be one of the most profound moments in history, even if it's microbial or some kind of non-carbon life. But we come from this very extractive culture. So the real challenge is, can we meet this discovery with humility, with restraint? How do we approach it in a different way? With like stewardship rather than like claim or use. So there's a form of like ethical intelligence in different art, and we can look at different cultures to see how they are responding to these different futures or emotionally responding. What is resonating when we look at these other cultures' artworks in our hearts and our minds that helps serve as guideposts for us of how we can make something happen differently, how we can experience differently. So for me, this is the bigger question and revelation when I experience art from other cultures. I don't know if did I answer your question or just,
Yeah, yeah. No, and I guess the other part is how do we, um, one of the things that with humanity and deep space, we've always, talked about that space in this conversation, it's a planetary conversation. I mean, it's not a few countries or a few companies or whatever. And to your point, and so how do we do a better job of finding and incorporating and imagining and using art from, in fact, very different cultures who might imagine these things in very, very different ways. Because most of certainly what I'm exposed to, I've seen some is mostly Western leaning things of that nature. Some, but there's all sorts of other cultures historically and presently that express these things in that reflect their culture as well. I mean, how do we? Is that something we should be thinking about doing, or
100%, definitely. I show my artwork all around the world, and something that I love, a huge part of the work is that I make the work and then I put it out there. And it's
right?
what is going to happen when we put it out there. And it's beautiful to see how different cultures respond and the unexpected synchronicities that come up and how much I can learn from that from witnessing. And likewise, visiting these other countries, looking at their historical artworks. What I was speaking of is understanding these cultural values by experiencing art throughout the ages is a direct reflection of my experience. So it's very important. And this is something that I am deeply concerned about with our new technologies like AI, homogenizing us and kind of centering us into one way of thinking. So how do we make sure that we continue to engage these other cultures, other elements is on us. It's our
Yeah,
responsibility to look that out, to reach out to other human beings, to try to talk to other people that have different points of view than us.
right.
This is
Andy?
super important.
Yes, I mean, I'm maybe not the scholar of art that I would need to be to give you a good answer to that. Um, but if we talk about art as being poetry, being an example of art, then that connection that Amy's just referred to is really important. Um, there's a kind of emotion recollected in tranquility is a sort of Wordsworth quote about daffodils. We experience an emotion, and somebody who can write or paint or sing or sculpt about that can maybe make that connection and say, listen, this is I experienced this and this is what I felt. Did you feel that too? Can you feel that like I feel it? And that's where you start to connect with people. I don't think necessarily that's a cultural thing. We all cry, we all laugh, maybe at different things and in different ways, but the human emotions to respond to an experience are pretty uniform, I would have thought. So it kind of doesn't really matter too much if we don't understand how important the moon might be in Buddhist culture, or how important the solar system or the representation of the sun might be in another culture. We experience that in the same way as humans. It's only how we make sense of it that varies
Yeah.
from creed to creed, from experience to experience, I would say.
Yeah, Amy, I'm going to come back to something you said that uh, I thought was interesting, and that's the role of AI as we move forward. Um, I mean, I'm not, I'm a full believer in AI. I use it quite frequently for research purposes, and it's inevitable. It's here. It's not going away. But is there any risk, perhaps, in using AI or employing it in ways that perhaps allows us to skim over some of the deep thoughts um, that are oftentimes required, where those sparks come from after sometimes thinking about a problem for a very long time. I mean, even personally, I've done some research at times and done something, and I something came up very quick, and I looked at it and I thought, it had kind of took a step, stood back for a minute, going, I would have probably thought about this for an hour or two and wrote some notes and then come up with something. And what it came up with was interesting. But again, is this a somewhat of a concern to our humanity and our creativity?
So yes, definitely. I work with this often. So I can speak from my own work and experience. And for the audience, I've been in AI since 2015. So something that I question really often is the unintended consequences of our technologies. And with AI, this really limits our focus. So I have so many things to say in response to what you just said.
Mhm.
One of the major aspects is, first of all, it's presenting to us, if we think about generative text AI, like ChatGPT or Claude, it's presenting to us something that looks finished and polished. And Andy, I'd love to hear your perspective about this part too, because of the writing. And it looks really nice, but it is not the same process as us getting to the content in that. And when you actually read the content, it often does not make sense, even if it appears to be well written. So, something I've been doing with my large language models is training it to help me learn, like work in the process of my thinking. I have a degree in philosophy and I understand the value of deep thinking, and we live in this very quick, like 200 character text culture, and now we just live in a wall of text culture of like the AI coming really fast. And there's a lot of overwhelm in that. We don't get to that like 10,000 hours of expertise if we're just banging it out, and all the mistakes that come in that process. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is all that is left out of the training. So we have all these other cultural items that are left out of the training. And then it's also only based on language and language tagging. So for me as an artist, by the time it gets to my thinking mind and my language, that's like a fourth, fifth order down. The first
Mhm.
thing is like a physical perception. Then I kind of go through just different orders. Like I have a kind of an emotional feeling in the body. Sometimes I can conjure up like an image or a thought. And then by the time it gets to words, it's something else. So AI also leaves out all that part of the experience as well. So those are two of my like top concerns in
Yeah.
this family, but we could have a whole podcast about that. Andy, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, especially with like the language generation.
Yeah, this is a really big issue in the writing world at the moment, as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear. There are already novels out there that are AI generated, and they are not necessarily differentiated between those that are not. Although I understand there are some publishers, maybe not just in the UK, who are now going to put stickers on books saying this book has been human generated. It feels like that is the inverse to the way it should be. Surely the norm should be that most art, written or otherwise, should be human generated, and we only need to know that it isn't. In the few instances that at the moment that it appears not to be. So it seems a very odd thing to say this is a human generated book rather than the opposite way round. But to sort of extend that out, I don't think that any poem that I've read that has been generated by AI, by whatever large language model that I've been looking at, has ever reached a point where it understands something in a way that exceeds what a human might understand. Unless we have self-aware systems that can experience the same things in the same way as a human and then represent that in some form of art, it is simply synthesizing what already exists that somebody else has already felt and it is only patching that together with other words that make it seem like this is original. Um, Poetry being my thing, you have to experience what you write about. I mean, if you don't, you have no insight. You cannot
Mhm.
justifiably write about something of which you have no experience. But the public judge this and not the other poets. The public will decide, I like that poem. Okay, it was written by a machine using large language models, but I like it. I like it better than this one from a slightly more cerebral poet who wants me to understand something that I don't quite follow. So the public might judge actually that AI is more rewarding as an experience of a consumer than the real thing, and that is the worry. Uh,
Yeah.
we
Don't
we are we
we? I
are
mean,
needed.
I would,
yeah,
I would,
this, I'll ask both of you. I mean, that seems like that's a big loss for humanity.
well, I would actually say, okay, so this is part of the argument for sure. But if we look at that full range, like Andy, you illuminated at the beginning, we're talking about something that's generated as a final output. We can
Right.
also look at using these generative models as part of the process. Like when I was saying, learn in the way that I learn. I use generative language AI often for brainstorm collaborator to help
Right.
me push my ideas faster. Like if I could have conversations with you guys every day, where would I get? But I can't always be in the room with an expert. So I oftentimes say, embody this or to help me get to a next place. It's also amazing for like crunching numbers and seeing connections and data that we wouldn't otherwise see in big data sets. So, I mean, it has its place. But I think, Andy, you're really illuminating a huge fundamental question of our time about authorship and agency and what we're relying on. And this is a big danger I've seen in a number of the studies that humans tend to have more confidence in the AI than they should. Like if you look at
Mhm.
the confidence amount that goes up versus the actual, I don't know how to word this correctly, like technical skills gain or the actual accuracy, the confidence level is very high of the humans, but the accuracy is not that much higher. So there's this part of it too, where it goes back to Chris's original point of like, what are we not learning in the process? And then how much are we trusting that this technology can actually do something that humans can do? And how do we keep that in the right proportion?
Yeah, we have a question. It's a little bit long, but let me read it because it says from Ernie Yarnarella, who I know is a big, he also has done writing in this area. It says, art is a humanizing, I dare say, ecologizing role in our collective lives. Should it be? Propagandist, case in point, Frederick Turner's epic poem, What Demonizes Spacefaring Skeptics as Eco-Theist or Deist. What's your mind in terms of does poetry, what kind of role they have, and does poetry in this case and art have a higher role to play?
There is a famous quote. I'm not quite sure. It's somebody in the 20th century, but they said that the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, which is a very interesting and quite grandiose claim for what we do. People tend not to read poetry very much these days in general, and they certainly don't write it very much. So that it implies that there is something slightly higher about the art form that we work in that we are trying to make sense of the world, this world and another world possibly, but we're trying to make sense of the world through our own experience and focus on something small in the hope that we get a more general truth that emerges from that. And I know a lot of poets who are quite happy working at small all the time, but every so often you want to say, look, does this little thing have meaning for everybody? And that is where maybe that human element of writing can reveal to us something far bigger than what we can see. Our soul, if you like, or whatever that might be, is there in little objects. And if enough people share the feeling about that little object and the effect it has, or that little experience, then you get something collective, and people accept that that is a universal truth. It takes a long time to achieve that, but there are some poems that say things that now everybody kind of, well, we all get that. Yeah, daffodils are beautiful. Um, so it might take a while for us all to accept that, but poets help that process along. I think in the same way that artists do, they show us something different about what their eyes see compared to what another person's eyes might see, and maybe reveal a truth about their experience in a way that I couldn't about mine.
And
Can
I
make
Amy?
sense or
see
not?
that Dennis has made a comment that's really nice to compliment Dennis. Says the question about poetry, are we writing it for ourselves or strictly for consumption? AI works well for consumption, but for ourselves, AI cannot touch.
Yeah, that's very good.
Mhm.
That's very good. Very profound.
And he
So,
also said architecture. I'll answer that other
yeah,
question. And I think that was in response to when we were asking about different art forms. So I'll take this one. And actually I saw on my LinkedIn somebody asked about design, the role of design. I think I could speak to both of them in space. Architecture and design are where some of these ethics take form. So it's really important that we study them here. This is where our values become structures of engaging, of thinking. They become habitats, interfaces, systems. In my perspective, this is also where we're understanding if we're building for collaboration or survival, for relationships, for a more conscious future. So, what values are we embedding in the architecture? What values are we embedding the design? This is how we really consciously co-create these futures, architect these futures, and design these futures. And that to me stems like goes from the habitats that we have to relationships with other life to using space as a mirror to reflect back on how we engage on Earth.
yeah, I think it's interesting that as we look at extended space exploration, extended space flight, and deeper into space, we have to remind ourselves that we are still human, and so therefore, how do we how can art help us to maintain that humanity in space? I mean, habitats are a good example. For someone, the longest right now we've had people living in space is, I think, 420 days. That was an ISS. It's 260 plus miles up. You look out the window, you can see the Earth. You get fresh food delivered every 3 months or so. So you're sort of subject to zero G and certain amount of radiation, but it's not necessarily the same as spending extended periods of time on the lunar surface, where you're not going to get food delivered every 3 months, or in the case of an extended mission to Mars, which at its minimum is 3 years. How does art help? I mean, what can art do perhaps to help us? With two things. How can art help us experience and maintain our humanity? And also, how might art play a role in actually having art being done by people in extended space flight off Earth?
I always think it's very interesting whenever you have a picture painted of an astronaut when they're interviewed or a crew or they discuss the science of a mission. There's often a little aside that says, "Oh, and Andy, who is the flight specialist in this area, is also a very accomplished painter or plays classical guitar, or
Right.
they can't just be an astronaut because they must be something else as well." And I saw something that one of my Simon I was referring to before sent me a couple of links to interesting science versus art comments, and one of the people speaking said scientists are often quite sneery about anyone involved in the arts because science has answers. It has absolutes by which you can measure. It has scales. Most art is not on a scale. It is not. It doesn't contain absolutes. There's no perfection or imperfection. It is simply a representation of emotion. So there is quite a distinction between those who do science and those who do art. But we seem very keen to make our scientists also be seen to be artists as well. So that idea of being art, making people do art, that might be a thing. Yeah, that's my feeling about it. Anyway, there's not a hard line between science and art. We function in both spheres. One might inform the other, or they may be completely separate, but we can function with both those things going on at the same time. We are not just scientists or artists or humanitarians.
Amy?
Yeah, you were talking about science as being an absolute and how that somehow contradictory to artists, but science is also about questions,
Right.
and seeking to ask better questions or seeking answers, experimenting, and art is about that too. So, I think that there's a whole debate available there as well. Um, so, but Chris, you were asking about this idea, and the first thing that came to mind for me was our mutual friend Frank White, who wrote The Overview Effect. And this is
Mhm.
a book on, how astronauts looked at the world differently when they were in space. And art in this way helps us to imagine, what does it feel like to be in that perspective? What does it feel like to be in a different perspective? What does it feel like to be in these futures before we're inside of them? And so it prepares us emotionally and ethically for the realities that science and technology are bringing us closer. Like I mentioned earlier, the canary in the coal mine. This space is yes, like a technical and scientific frontier, but it's also cultural. It's also political. It's very spiritual as well. And art can function in all of those realms and speak to a lot of those realms. So artists are also multidisciplinary
Yeah.
that way too.
Yeah. Um, what about I mean, I'm always struck, and you both alluded to it, the number of great scientists who also dabbled quite seriously in the arts, whether it was painting or music or drawing or whatever. And when we think about um, preparing our species, and we're not preparing, we are a spacefaring civilization already. It's
Mhm.
not science fiction. And we obviously, as we think about how do we prepare, educate people to be spacefaring citizens, responsibility and those types of things, art would not be part of that, normally that part of that conversation, but perhaps it should.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on something that I used to do in my working life, I used to teach medical students and mostly scientific elements of what they were doing, the research skills. But because people knew I was a poet, I also got roped in to do the humanities in medicine module, which was just run once per intake. And what I set the students a task to do was to think of a clinical experience they'd had where they were exposed to something that happened in the ward or the operating theatre. And rather than use what they would call the clerking approach, which is where they take measurements and readings and blood pressure and so on, think of this as an emotional experience. Try and make sense of this from your own perspective by using the language of poetry or painting or drawing or sculpting, and use your emotional side to represent your experience rather than simply using the scientific analytical side. And some got that, and as Amy said, that we're not uniquely one or the other, and there are unanswered questions in all sorts of areas. But often those who have chosen science are not expecting to be given a task to look at things from an artistic point of view, and it can be quite a destabilizing thing for them. So they needed to be guided through that process, and eventually they would come up with something. And technically, it might not have been a wonderful poem, but it was from them, and it was from their heart, and it was what they actually felt about something. That's maybe what we can do with
Yeah.
astronauts or those who work in space. Encourage them to search themselves for an emotional response to a scientific occurrence rather than simply just go on the science.
Interesting.
I'd
Amy?
also speak to the creativity
Yeah.
involved in science. So maybe it's art is a subdivision under creativity and creative thinking, whether it's, poetry, visual art, installation, whatever the form is. The most brilliant scientists I know are the ones who have this very kind of specific creative thinking in science. And it's beautiful to see that illuminated. And I also see something that happens in science and math, technology too, quite often, that when they get to a certain point of their profession or career, you get to these certain questions that become a spiritual question, really, or and definitely ethical questions too. And in a lot of professions in America, in the sciences, we can't just go up on stage and speak about that openly. An artist can. And so sometimes this is a way for also other professions to explore How do we feel out those other territories that are beyond what our specific profession can measure or explain? That's where it gets really interesting into how do then people explore and express that as well. They might continue to do it through their own profession, or they might cross-pollinate. So, for example, most of the physicists I know are, a lot of them are musicians. There's this really interesting crossover, and biologists tend to be more visual artists. What is it with that thinking? This is something I notice a lot working across art and science. Like, what is it in that thinking? Well, physics, we feel in waves, and that is what music is as well. Biology, we tend to look at like under a microscope and see the interaction, see the beauty. So this is something that I think people innately know, even if they choose to express or practice or research through a certain discipline. There's other ways to figure this out. And when
Mhm.
you are creative and open, whatever field that you're into, you get to a point where you're like, I'm okay with asking these broader questions outside of my field. I'm okay with exploring. In fact, I'm hungry to do it because it might inform my work better.
I found
Yeah,
that
we have
absolutely
go
amazing.
ahead.
Amy, that sorry, Chris. The
That's
idea
all right.
that that there might be a predisposition towards a particular kind of artistic expression depending on your scientific discipline. That if that's not already being researched, then it needs to be because that is fantastic. Just an amazing insight. Sorry, Chris, I put across
Yeah,
you
sorry,
there.
no, no. You might look at the check out the question from Maria and see how you guys reflect. I won't read it all, but it's interesting. She did say that she was excited that she had learned about this talk from one of the leaders of her local astronomy club, hosted in a geology building, and so pleased to find out that this kind of conversation was going on, which is one of the things we like to do is to make sure that lots of people understand that these are opportunities to talk about these multidisciplinary issues. So, if you look at her question or her point, what are your reflections on that? How can we work to bridge those communities together better? Between photography, art, and other things to be more open about, and also in not necessarily literal conversations.
Well, and she was actually talking about pinhole photography,
Yes.
which is, and she says is very much an art and science, truly. And yes, my first job was in a public observatory, and we used to do these kinds of experiments all the time. That instead of talking about these in different ways, you actually just get to experience it. You get to go build it, and this is something that a lot of children get to experience when they're fortunate
Yeah.
with education. But as adults, we don't really do those kinds of fun things anymore unless we're doing it with our kids.
Right.
Why did that stop? Like that's one way I think we can continue to bridge our communities together is through these shared physical experiences
Yeah.
through making and also seeing that maybe there's art and science in almost all that we do.
Not with a lens, but with just a simple aperture.
Hmm.
Yeah, we did this at physics when I was at school. Pinhole
Hmm.
cameras.
So, Andy, you talked about you used to teach. What were you teaching? What was that you mentioned?
Hmm.
Yeah, we would teach students to make sense of clinical experiences through
Yeah.
writing about them emotionally.
Okay.
If I can kind of draw on my experience of editing a poetry magazine, we get a lot of submissions where people write very technically very good poems about what they see, but
Hmm.
I could get that from a photograph. What I want, if I read it, is to find out what they think or feel about what they see, because that's the next level up. That's where our human expression gives a bit more to the reader. If you only say what you see, you might as well just represent it as an image. But if you want people to know how that makes you feel, that's where the poem comes. That's where a good piece of descriptive writing in a novel
Yeah.
comes.
And let me say also to those watching, I would encourage you to please go to Project Gabiona. You can sign up; it's free to get their what they publish. Because I've been impressed by a lot of the pieces in on that do just that. They talk, where people are imagining themselves having lived in deep space for a number of years, and they are kind of reflecting on that, how they feel about being off Earth and being in space for a long period of time. And I think I agree. I think looking at how people feel is very important. Amy, you were going to say something, I believe.
Oh, I was thinking
No,
about a few different things, but we also haven't talked about dancers and the somatic
that's
experience and
let's talk about dancers.
yeah, I mean, I think all these fields, right? I don't mean to limit in any way
Right,
expressions and the creative expressions. And I think that's one thing, if I could highlight in this whole talk, is that the creative thinking and this feeling expression is not limited to art. We're naming it that way because I'm an artist, Andy's a writer, a poet, but it is something that it is larger than that. It's something that we all share as humans and
right.
people tap into.
Um, Michelle has a Michelle Hollis, who's also a colleague of mine from way back, has talks about if you look at that her comment, audio and visual assets for the takeoff through space. Is there a place for art in that experience uh, as opposed to kind of traditional mainstream media?
I want to take that one as David Bowie. I think David
Okay,
Bowie, in my heart, is the just so resonant for that long, long journey. So I wasn't alive when he made his work that went off with the aircraft, but I know that it was broadcast live and he was playing the whole time and his music was playing. So through this journey, he really understood that before we can truly habit space physically, we have to inhabit it in the imagination through the sound, through the atmosphere, through the feeling. And this is to me one of my like favorite examples. And then also too, I have artwork in space, and this has been an interesting journey. It's some of the work that I question the most when I do bio art on Earth. This doesn't affect anyone. If it was going to go, like if it was going to be something that was developed, it would have to go through FDA trials before it can like
right,
impact someone. But in space, it's really just an uncharted frontier and there's not a lot of regulation. So some of the art that I did was my first piece that sent art to space was done in Japan. It was called Echoes from the Valley of Existence. And I was given this prompt to make artwork about the future of death life, 100 years or more in the context of the last snow. So it was in Sapporo, Japan. They get so much snow. And they had this beautiful biennale that took artists from 100 years and earlier, from 100 years today, and 100 years in the future, representing this concept of the last snow. So I thought about our digital afterlives and all these things we leave online and our DNA and all these things we're leaving on a daily basis and how they
hmm,
can make a story about us in the future. And then I felt like it was a beautiful installation. It had sound elements, but it just wasn't enough. And I remembered a company that was sending DNA and images to space. So I contacted them and I said, will you sponsor this project? So as part of the project, people had the opportunity to leave their images, text, or DNA for space. And to me, this was really the art where the artwork began. Is like, would you leave DNA? Would you leave images? Would you leave text? Why or why not? Would you leave one or the other? And then actually this goes into space for this far future. How will people, so it's actually like actively giving people the opportunity to engage this. It's actually now
yeah,
on the moon, this like compendium together. Another project I did was a new version of the Golden Records. I was invited to do the cover and then be a partner on the project as well. So these are some of the opportunities when we send items into space and artwork into space that we're enlivening our imaginations here, but we're also have to really think about what are we leaving for the future and how can it impact and affect the future. And this to me is the much more important and bigger question. And some of the this artwork that I've sent to space, these are some of the hardest philosophical questions and ethical questions I have. I was mentioning bioart on Earth doesn't hurt anybody, but I can't foresee some of these
yeah.
futures. And
Somebody posted on here, I guess, a recommendation or a suggestion in Praise of Mystery, a poem for Europa by Ada Limon, Limon. So people may want to look at that. I'll certainly check it out. In the few minutes we have left, I want to ask a question that we kind of alluded to earlier. Um, a lot of people have talked about, and I personally believe that among the hard problems of space and space exploration are certainly science, technology, engineering, all of those things. But one of the big also conundrums deals with humans and how, given human nature, how are we actually going to do this in an ethical, responsible way? And I guess, can we do it? And I'm just curious as what role might art play in helping us explore the depths of that question as opposed to just space itself, but hopefully the humanity. You alluded to earlier, Amy, about finding maybe perhaps some sort of primitive single cell life on another body, like on Mars. I mean, I think if we do that, that's a exciting but profound question for humanity. Is what do you do? It's life. So and I don't have an answer. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I
Yeah.
look at, art as this kind of ethical intelligence and
Right.
opportunity to explore the ethics.
I like that word,
And yeah,
ethical intelligence.
and I think, it gives us, we talked about a lot how we can step into these kinds of futures and do we want to engage in this way? Um, the art is important because what resonates in our hearts and minds. I was mentioning, I look at as a guidepost for us, right? This is if it's negative, if it's positive, what questions come out of it? How do we ultimately feel? And then what do we do now that we know that feeling? Do we want to keep going forward, or is it nudging us to look at things in a different way or do what we can to shape different futures?
Andy?
Yeah, I'm not sure that putting people into a capsule and sending them into space is going to take away aspects of their humanity or creativity. It may leave less time for them to exercise but it won't necessarily change them as people. So I think the essence of Project Abiona is the poems that we've received is to say people have the same hang-ups and the
Yeah,
same issues out there, several thousand million miles away.
yeah,
Um, they don't change as people.
yeah.
It's just that the context in which they're expressing themselves will be different.
Andy, do you have, I think you maybe have, you have a poem one of your poems that you might read real quickly
Hmm.
that from
I,
Project Abiona?
I could, yeah. Yes, I would be delighted to. I'm going to use one of the poems. It's a very short one, which one of the three people who run the project, Amy Norton, wrote. And people tend to write under the guise of somebody who's fictional because obviously it's from the future. So Amy, as I say, is a research astronomer at Stanford and works partly with NASA as well. And she's written as Ava Blake, who is an alpha technician on Michalka 4, the Jovian telemetry base in orbit around Callisto, dedicated to receiving and sending data for spacecraft performing Jupiter flybys. And she's a physicist and she's a second generation off-worlder. And this is time stamped as 2134, 21st of September. And I'm presuming from the context of the poem, it was a gas mask drill on the station she was working in. So the poem is short and it's called Nothing Says I Love You Like a Gas Mask. A standard issue chemical oxygen rebreather will do, donned by crew, chin pocket and head harness snug. When the spark sparked, routine turned to risk, flame turned to flamelet, floating spheres of burn. Nothing says I love you like a closed circuit with a counter long. Smolder only survives so long, then it's back to inhale, exhale, repeat, and eye contact if you can get it.
Thank you. So
Okay.
we're out of time. I want to thank both of you again. For somebody ask again to remind everybody, just to restate, it's Project Abiona, and if you Google that, you'll come up with a site. And I would also encourage everyone to go to Amy's website, which is amazing. I visit there all the time for inspiration, and particularly if I've had a glass of wine, like I can get deeper into her work that way. And I mean that in a positive way. Also, I want to thank all of our sponsors for making this possible. And we will be, again, you can go to humanityindeepspace.com. You can also put your name if you haven't already, which you'll put in our database, and you'll get all the information. We do occasionally send out articles and things of that nature as well. And this will be available also in a week or so. All of our webcasts are recorded and are put on our YouTube channel, and so this will be available as well to those of you who want to revisit it or pass it on to someone else. Again, I'm Chris Kimmel, and I want to thank again Amy and Andy for a great conversation, and we look forward to everyone and talking in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you for joining us for Humanity in Deep Space. In his book, Pale Blue Dot, A Vision of the Human Future in Space, Carl Sagan wrote, "Your own life, or your band's, or even your species, may be owed to a restless few, drawn by a craving they can hardly articulate or understand, to undiscovered lands and new worlds." Our continued exploration of space is accompanied by profound questions, responsibilities, and obligations. What is our place and ultimate responsibility to the larger universe? And how do we maintain a sense of humanity as we leave the planet Earth? These questions and more are discussed in our videos, as well as other curated content at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.